In 68 AD, Nero was dead. With him ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first dynasty of emperors of Rome, and a question was opened. Who rules the Roman Empire? This wasn't a new question. Rome had always worked as a king of the hill game between the great families, but now, just like in the civil wars, this question was gonna be answered with swords. Today, we will follow the story of the Year of the Four Emperors, the great game for the future of Rome, and we're gonna do it month by month. So let's get straight into it. First of all, let's provide a very quick introduction to our four characters. Galba is gonna be the first one we talk about, so we'll leave him for the beginning of our story. Our second figure appears in Lusitania, modern Portugal. Marcus Salvus Otho, once governor there and once Nero's companion in pleasure. He was elegant, impulsive, and dangerously ambitious. Plutarch writes that Otho could neither endure to serve nor to command. But he longed for both. He had expected Galba, our first character we'll talk about in a bit, to adopt him as heir. He even bribed astrologers to foretell it. But when Galba chose another, well, Otho's disappointment turned to fury. To the north, along the Rhine frontier, the third Clemens waits, Aulus Vitellius, governor of Lower Germany. Suetonius calls him a glutton made emperor, but that is only half the truth. Vitellius had charm and the loyalty of men who had fought too long in the cold for too little recognition. When the word reached the legions that Galba had slighted them, they shouted his name, Ave Vitellius Caesar. The Rhine armies were among the most powerful in the empire, their camps filled with hardened veterans. They had crushed revolts and watched emperors come and go, but none had rewarded them as Nero had. To them, Vitellius represented a return to those indulgent, soldier-loving days. It was the spark that would ignite a continental civil war. And finally, we get to our final character. Not yet emperor, not yet declared, but waiting. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, legate of Judea. He was fighting a war in the ruins of Jerusalem. His banners are dusty, his men seasoned. He had no ambition, not yet. But when the first three emperors brawled, his name was rising like a tide from Syria and Egypt. Tacitus, in the opening lines of HistoriaX, seems to speak directly to this moment. The secret of empire was laid bare for all to see, that emperors could be made elsewhere rather than at Rome. Rome begins this story not with a war but with a silence, the kind that follows a scream. In June 68 AD, the last of the Julio-Claudians flees the city that once worshipped him. Nero, emperor since the age of 16, now rides through the outskirts of Rome disguised, terrified, abandoned by the Senate and guard alike. Tacitus writes that he wandered between fear and rage, muttering that even in death he would be mourned as an artist. But no one mourned. Surrounded in a suburban villa, he drove a dagger into his throat. But his death, while good news for many, did not bring peace, it brought vacancy. For the first time since Augustus, Rome had no emperor, no dynasty, and no agreed-upon rule of succession. The Senate, that old and ceremonial body, suddenly mattered again, at least for a few desperate days. They hailed Servius Sulpicius Galba, the stern governor of Hispania, a senatorially approved emperor. After all, Galba had been the first to rise against Nero, and his legions had already proclaimed him emperor months before the end of Nero. In the provinces, other legions watched closely. For years, Rome's armies had been more loyal to their generals than to the distant men in the Palatine Palace. Now they realized they could make emperors too. When Galba entered Rome in October 68 AD, he brought with him an image of old-fashioned discipline. He marched at the head of his legions on foot, ordering immediately the execution of soldiers who had been loyal to Nero. "I choose my soldiers, I do not buy them," he declared, a statement of virtue that sounded noble but, well, dangerous. The Praetorians, who had betrayed Nero in exchange for promises of reward, found themselves unpaid and resentful. Across the Alps, the Legion of Germania Superior and Inferior grumbled. Galba had ignored their petition for recognition. He wanted justice, but justice meant that a lot of people were gonna be disappointed. Meanwhile, in Lusitania, Marcus Salvus Otho, former friend and, well, cuckold of Nero, saw an opportunity. As we said, Otho had expected to be adopted by Galba. He had even financed Galba's journey to power. But Galba, suspicious of his ambition, instead adopted Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a quiet young noble known for his virtue. It was a decision that sealed Galba's fate. So as 68 draws to a close and our year of the four emperors begins, we have Galba in Rome, austere but isolated, Otho in Lusitania, plotting revenge, Vitellius in Germania, backed by angry, unpaid soldiers, and Vespasian in Judea, commanding the East wealth and arms. And over them all, the ghost of Nero still haunted the empire. Coins bearing his face continued to circulate. Songs invoking his name spread in taverns, and impostors claiming to be the reborn Nero appeared in Greece and Asia. To many in the provinces who did not experience Nero directly, Nero's death felt less like the end of a tyrant than the loss of a familiar god. Rome itself was anxious, uncertain. The city had not yet seen open war, but the omens were grim. Cassius Dio writes of lightning striking the capital, and of statues of the emperors crumbling in the forum. Suetonius adds that the oxen leading Galba's sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter refused to move, a sign, the augurs whispered, that the gods rejected him. By December, Galba's rule was already unraveling. The armies of Germania openly refused to recognize him, declaring for their own commander, Aulus Vitellius. January 69 AD. Rome woke up to winter under a new emperor and an old fear. Galba had been princeps for barely half a year, yet he already looked like a relic. Tacitus paints him as of austere discipline and ancient virtue, but ill-suited to command men of our time. The Senate called him father of the nation, but the streets whispered otherwise, that he was old, that he was cheap, that the empire had traded Nero's cruelty for decay. The year opened with the soldiers of the Rhine still in open defiance. In Germania Superior and Inferior, the legions had declared for Vitellius. They marched south with terrifying speed. Whole armies of hardened veterans who had known no defeat since the days of Drusus and Germanicus. Each carried not only his sword, but also his grievance. They wanted their reward one way or another. In Rome, the news struck like thunder. Galba tried to act strong, but those around him could see that the end was coming. The Praetorian Guard knew that Vitellius was not going to be generous to them. He had his own soldiers to look after. So they turned to the new savior, Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho had been maneuvering for weeks. Suetonius tells us he had long been whispering among the soldiers, promising them the donative which Galba had denied. Otho was charming, flamboyant, and reckless, the very opposite of Galba's cold austerity. To some, he seemed like Nero reborn, to others a new chance at fortune. On January 15, he struck. That morning, Galba was carried in a litter to the Forum. His usual entourage was surrounding him. Unknown to him, the Praetorian Guard had already sworn allegiance to Otho at the Praetorian camp on the Esquiline. Otho slipped away from the imperial procession without being noticed, claiming to inspect the foundation of a temple. Once inside the camp, he was hailed as emperor. The sound of soldiers cheering echoed throughout the city like the roar of a distant storm. Tacitus' account of what followed is one of the most chilling in Roman history. Galba, hearing the tumult, rode out to confront the rebels. An emperor of the old school, believing loyalty could still be commanded by dignity alone. But when his cohort saw the army of Praetorians marching down to him, they faltered. The emperor was left alone to be struck down in the streets. One soldier, the centurion Camurius, delivered the final blow. His head was cut off and paraded through the streets. Piso was dragged from hiding in the temple of Vesta and murdered beside him. Piso was his heir. The Senate, terrified and leaderless, declared Otho emperor within hours. The same man who had hailed Galba restorer of liberty now praised his murderer as savior of the state. Rome had changed emperors twice in 7 months, and the year had only just begun. Yet Otho's triumph was hollow. Even as the blood dried on the stones of the Forum, news arrived. Vitellius' legions were already crossing the Alps. The empire now had 2 emperors, one in Rome, one in Germania, each with tens of thousands of men ready to die for them. Tacitus captures the mood perfectly. In that year, shame and honor, right and wrong, all were confused. No distinction remained between the innocent and the guilty. Vitellius' commanders led 2 great columns into northern Italy, plundering towns that had not yet chosen sides. Each of them carried with them the arrogance of a general already victorious. Cecina, in particular, was brutal. His men pillaged Cremona and terrorized the Po Valley, declaring themselves avengers of the Rhine. By February, Otho realized the war could no longer be avoided. He began fortifying the Apennine passes and ordered his navy to guard the Ligurian coast. Rome turned once again into a city of rumors. Astrologers prophesied victory, omens were analyzed in entrails of oxen, and old women whispered that Nero himself would return from the east to reclaim his throne. February 69 AD opened on an empire divided. In Rome, Otho ruled as emperor in name. To the Senate, he posed as restorer of order, to the people as Nero reborn. Young, elegant, indulgent, promising public games and remissions of debt. Tacitus remarks bitterly that many longed for the vices of Nero, as though they were his virtues. Statues of the dead emperor were quietly raised again. Singers performed his songs, and Otho, rather than silence them, smiled. It was politics through nostalgia. Makes you think, doesn't it, that somebody could actually be nostalgic of Nero's time. The threat of war, of course, brings this kind of thoughts, but also one has to admit that this is kind of proof that Nero did give a lot to the people, at least enough to create this kind of thoughts in darker times. Vitellius, after all, was coming. Otho, surprisingly, moved with energy. Suetonius, no admirer of his, concedes that in the field he showed courage equal to his ambition. Within days of his ascension, Otho had sent his brother Titianus to secure northern Italy, ordered the Praetorians to the front, and summoned the Danubian legions for reinforcements. He chose his generals carefully: Suetonius Paulinus, the same man who had crushed Boudica in Britain, Gaius Licinus Proculus, veteran of Africa, and Annius Gallus, an experienced campaigner. Rome had not seen such mobilization since the civil wars of the Republic. But Otho's greatest weapon was speed. He resolved to meet Vitellius' armies before the two columns could unite again. In March, he left Rome in triumphal procession, greeted by cheering crowds. Tacitus notes that he wept openly at these cries. Whether in a triumph of vanity or genuine emotion was uncertain. Behind him marched the Praetorian Guard, untested in field war, more accustomed to the marble courtyards of Rome than the mud of the Po Valley. The first clash came near Placentia, modern-day Piacenza. The vanguard of Vitellius' forces, led by Caecina, attempted to storm the city, defended by Otho's general Spurinna. The citizens, loyal to Otho, helped hold the walls. After a day of fierce fighting, ladders overturned, siege engines burning, Caecina was forced to withdraw. His troops, humiliated, began looting nearby farms to vent their anger. All this looting created a problem. Both Caecina and Fabius Valens, the commander of the second column, wanted to gain as much as possible from this campaign. So they quarreled, each claiming priority in Vitellius' name. Otho seized the moment. He advanced north and established his headquarters at Brixellum, modern-day Brescello, on the southern bank of the Po. There, in a camp between river and plain, he gathered his legions and waited for the enemy to cross. Tacitus, ever the dramatist, sets the scene like a stage. On one side, the soldiers of the capital, on the other, the veterans of the Rhine. The same language, the same arms, but different masters. Time waits for no one, and March came. Rome itself held its breath. Rumors ran ahead of the couriers that Vitellius' forces had already entered the city, that Otho had been killed, that Nero's ghost had been seen on the Appian Way. In truth, both sides hesitated. Otho's generals urged delay until reinforcements arrived from the east, while the Vitellians struggled with hunger and exhaustion after their Alpine march. But war has its own momentum. The two armies, barely controlled by their commanders, moved toward each other, guided by some sort of gravity, as if history wanted this battle to happen. Now, let's go into some specifics. Other than the Praetorian Guard, the Othonians had the 1st Adiutrix Legion with them, recently formed from sailors of the Misenum fleet. The Vitellians fielded the veteran legions 21 Rapax, 5th Alaude, and 1st Italica, men hardened on the Rhine frontier. Coming from the east were the Danubian legions, disciplined troops from Pannonia and Moesia, who could have easily tipped the balance. But Otho had his own ideas. He was an impulsive man, but also he was able to see that he was losing momentum. He wasn't sure he could trust his own men. He could trust the Praetorian Guard that could easily change sides if they started to understand that the situation was getting bad. To delay, he said, is to be defeated without a fight. He ordered his forces forward across the Po. The battle that followed, fought near the village of Bedriacum, wasn't really a pitched battle, it was a chaotic collision. The roads were narrow, the ground sodden, and neither side was able to fully deploy before the fighting began. Tacitus describes a confused struggle, where the men fought without order, without signals, drawn by rage more than command. Otho himself was not present. Against the advice of his officers, he remained behind in his camp to oversee logistics or, as his critics claimed, to avoid witnessing the carnage. Command in the field fell to his generals, notably Paulinus and Proculus. These were experienced men, but they were unable to impose unity on their divided contingents, didn't have the, let's say, aura of an emperor. After all, they were fighting to put an emperor on the throne, or to keep it, depending on the point of view, and the emperor wasn't there. The Vitellian vanguard, led by Cecina, struck first. His troops advanced along the road of the Via Postumia, banners high, drums echoing across the plains. The Othonians counterattacked fiercely, the first Adiutrix legion capturing a Vitellian eagle, a near-sacred act that sent a surge of hope through their ranks. But discipline faltered. Instead of consolidating, the new recruits of the fleet chased the enemy too far, and the counterstrike fell upon them. While the beginning of the confrontation was between two unorganized forces, the second column of Vitellian troops, led by Valens, came late but decisive. His legions entered the fray in perfect formation, hitting the Othonians in the flank. Tacitus notes the grim symmetry. Each side fought as if Rome's destiny hung on its own sword, yet neither could name the cause for which they fought. Their line buckled. The Praetorians broke first. They were well-trained, but unused to field war. By afternoon, the Othonian army was in full retreat toward Bedriacum, leaving the fields littered with corpses and broken standards. When the survivors reached their camp, they found no refuge. The Vitellians were pursuing them, storming the fortification and slaughtering the wounded. A few commanders attempted to rally a defense, but the men threw down their arms. The first battle of Bedriacum was over, and Vitellius had triumphed, or so it seemed. At Brixellum, Otho's base camp, the news arrived quickly. Otho's officers begged him to retreat south and continue the war. Reinforcements, after all, were already crossing the Adriatic, the Danubian legions, and yet he decided against it. He said, "It's not for the good of Rome that so many more of our sons should perish for my sake." That night he retired to his tent, wrote farewell letters to his family, and stabbed himself in the heart. When his soldiers found his body at dawn, they wept openly. Many kissed his hands and his wounds. Some even killed themselves beside him. Tacitus, usually merciless in judgment, writes with rare sympathy. He was more worthy of the empire than those who had taken it from him. Now, before we move on, let's take a second to notice that all of these characters have many faces, because historians talk about them in different ways. It is all marketing, propaganda. We have Otho as the second coming of Nero, a vain creature, and then when he dies, we see him as this honorable man who dies for Rome in order to avoid a longer war, or maybe, probably, because he didn't really think he could survive this. The Danubian legions were never gonna reach him in time. Now, Vitellius, we have seen him as this veteran commander, but also he was leading these beasts ready to plunder Italy itself for their own advantage. So what can we trust? Truth is, no one can tell you. No one can discern what the truth is in this. We can just take the entirety of the story and try to make our own mind by listening to it attentively. The story, after all, is not over. We have gone through 2 emperors who are now dead, and now we have a new one, Vitellius. Rome greeted the new emperor with fear. When Vitellius entered the city in late April, the air still carried the smoke of sacrifice and the stench of blood. He was a soldier's emperor, fat, jovial, careless, and for a brief moment that felt like relief. Tacitus calls him a man more fit to enjoy empire than to rule it. The Senate, terrified of another purge, met him with orchestrated adulation. Statues were raised, triumphs were promised. In every temple, new prayers were offered to the gods for peace. Vitellius' march to Rome had resembled an invasion more than a triumph. His armies moved south through the Po Valley, and they plundered every city in their path. At Cremona, they desecrated shrines. At Modena, they looted villas of men who had dared support Otho. Tacitus describes the horror in detail. It was the license of a conqueror without a war, the spoils of Italy as though she were a foreign land. Once inside Rome, the discipline of the Germanic legions collapsed entirely. The city's narrow streets were filled with drunken soldiers shouting, "Ave Vitellius!" Feasts were held in temples, and the Praetorian camp itself became a tavern. Vitellius seemed to enjoy it all. He dined 4 times a day, often publicly, and delighted in humiliated senators who had once served Nero or Galba. Suetonius, who loathed him, records that he took pleasure in cruelty as in a jest. He had men executed for bad omens or for refusing to drink with him. Yet, beneath the grotesque banquets and indulgent laughter, there was something fragile about his rule. The empire was vast, and loyalty shallow. In the east, the storm was already gathering. Vespasian, commander of 3 legions in Judea, had spent years in a brutal war against the Jewish rebels. He was not an aristocrat, not even a man of refinement. He was a soldier from humble Sabine stock, pragmatic and uncharismatic, but coldly efficient. By May, he had heard of Vitellius' victory. At first, he hesitated. His position was strong, but rebellion was treason, and the East had no appetite for civil war. Yet, the mood among his officers was changing. The turning point came in Alexandria. The prefect of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander, a Roman of Jewish descent and a former advisor of Nero, was the first to move. On July 1st, 69 AD, Alexander ordered the legions of Egypt to swear allegiance not to Vitellius, but to Vespasian. The act was both bold and carefully timed. Egypt controlled Rome's grain supply after all. Whoever held Alexandria could starve the capital. 2 days later, in Judea, Vespasian's own legions followed. Tacitus records with understated gravity. Then, in the camp at Caesarea, the soldiers saluted Vespasian as emperor. The East had spoken. The governor of Syria, old rival turned ally, joined the cause. He brought with him the legions of the Euphrate, veterans well supplied and eager for plunder. And so, this unofficial triumvirate was bringing together the richest provinces of the empire, from Antioch to Alexandria. Their strategy was to be simple and devastating. Vespasian would remain in the east to secure grain and reinforcements, while Mucianus, the governor of Syria, marched west to take Italy. Vitellius, meanwhile, celebrated. He had no spies in the east, no fleet strong enough to block Egypt, and no understanding of how quickly the tide was turning. His confidence was total. After all, he had the Germanic legions, and, well, he had defeated the one opponent he had. He disbanded the Praetorian Guard, too loyal to Otho, and replaced them with German auxiliaries, exactly like the Guard was afraid would happen. He even melted down temple relics to pay his soldiers. And in a gesture of absolute ambition and vanity, he renamed the months of the year after himself, as if to declare a new calendar of glory. But in the provinces his decrees were met with laughter. Coins bearing his image circulated reluctantly. In Gaul, mutinies spread. In Spain, governors wrote a letter of cautious neutrality. Tacitus observes that the provinces now judged the emperors, not the emperors the provinces. And so, through the summer of 69 AD, the empire began to fracture. Messages from Syria brought news that Mucianus was already marching west with tens of thousands of men. In the Balkans, the Danubian legions, who never reached Otho, now proclaimed for Vespasian as well, vowing revenge for their fallen comrades at Bedriacum. In July, while Rome feasted, Vespasian crossed into Egypt to take direct control of the grain ports. The symbolism was clear. He could choke the city into submission. By August, the empire was divided and ready for war. But it was a deeper transformation. What was happening was a process that would transform the Roman Empire forever. The Year of the Four Emperors brought a level of distrust in the central authority. Governors, as you are seeing, became the central position for each region, and this kind of transformation would never truly be brought back. In all of this, Vitellius tried to maintain his usual bravado, but Rome sensed the change. He was offering grand games to distract the mob, parading chariots through the circus and releasing exotic beasts in the arena. Yet, the crowds were thinner, the applause polite. Tacitus captures the strange mood. Men no longer feared him, but they pitied him, a prince unfit for empire amidst the ruins of power. Meanwhile, in the east, the rebellion was no longer a rumor, but a movement. Mucianus' columns were stretching miles across the dusty roads of Asia Minor, a symbol of inevitability. He advanced slowly, consolidating each province behind him, securing ports and sending envoys ahead to bribe Vitellian governors. Coins were struck in Antioch proclaiming Vespasianus Augustus, and everywhere the name spread like wildfire. Mucianus' advance was slow, but he was building alliances. He had ordered the Danubian legions, hardened veterans from the wars in Germany and the Balkans, to march west independently. They were led by Marcus Antonius Primus, a man Tacitus calls bold beyond prudence, a soldier whose ambition burned hotter than his loyalty. Antonius had been disgraced under Nero, reinstated under Galba, and now saw in Vespasian cause a path to glory and revenge. The Danubian legions moved fast, faster than Mucianus intended. By early September, they had crossed the Alps into northern Italy, their standards flashing the name of Vespasian. The Vitellian forces were garrisoned along the Po. They were caught unprepared. They had grown lazy in victory. At Verona, Antonius' scouts clashed with the Vitellian cavalry, marking the first blood of the new civil war. Tacitus describes the Danubians as men long wronged, with the rage of an army denied its battle. The Danubians were there to avenge the battle they were never able to fight, and they were not gonna stop. Vitellius' generals tried to respond. His brother, Lucius Vitellius, rallied the remaining Rhine legions around Cremona, just near the site of the Battle of Bedriacum, that we have called the First Battle of Bedriacum, and now we see why. Reinforcements from Rome arrived under Caecina and Valens, the two commanders that had led the two columns before, but their loyalty was brittle. Caecina, in particular, was playing a double game, writing secret letters to Antonius Primus, promising to switch sides in exchange for pardon and power under Vespasian. In late September, Caecina tried to make his words a reality. He assembled his army near Hostilia, declared for Vespasian, and urged his men to do the same. But his soldiers, veterans of Vitellius, refused to betray their emperor. They placed Caecina in chains and sent words to Cremona. They would fight. Antonius Primus seized the moment. His forces, 6 legions strong, advanced on Cremona under cover of darkness. Tacitus' account of what followed is one of the most violent in the HistoriaX. On the night of October 24, the armies met outside of the city, near the same fields soaked with the blood of Roman martyrs month before, the Second Battle of Bedriacum. The fighting raged through the night. It was a chaotic confrontation, head-to-head, between the Germanic legions and the Danubian legions. In the end, the Danubians were stronger. As the Danubians reached the camps of the Vitellian legions, they captured one of the eagles, the standards, specifically the one of the 21 Repax, a humiliation that shattered morale. The retreat turned into a massacre. As the survivors fled into Cremona, Antonius ordered the assault. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in Roman civil history. For 4 days, Cremona burned. Tacitus spares no detail. Temples were desecrated, citizens cut down in the streets, women were violated, slaves butchered. Treasures and pieces of art were looted and melted into ingots. It was a Roman army destroying a Roman city, eating it. A scene of horror that even hardened veterans could not stomach. He writes bitterly, "The conquerors were not satisfied with victory. The vengeance of strangers fell upon allies." Suetonius adds that when word reached Vitellius, he simply asked, maybe in shock, "And the feasts, were they magnificent?" Cremona's destruction broke the Western resistance. The Danubian legions, blood-stained but triumphant, now controlled the Po Valley. Cecina, freed from his chains, joined Antonius Primus and sent messengers to Rome. "Italy is ours." A bold move from a traitor. In the capital, panic erupted. The Senate met in confusion. Some called for negotiation, others urged Vitellius to abdicate. But he, stubborn and deluded, refused. He ordered new levies raised from the mob, promising to lead them himself. Rome filled with the sound of marching feet, but they were not disciplined legions. They were desperate men clutching weapons for an emperor already lost. Mucianus, still weeks away, urged restraint through letters, but Antonius, drunk on victory, marched south anyway. Every mile towards Rome was marked by towns throwing open their gates, eager to avoid another Cremona. By late October, the fate of the empire was sealed. Vitellius' supporters melted away. The Senate quietly began to prepare decrees of allegiance to Vespasian. We are nearing the final act. To live in a doomed city, part of a doomed regime, must be a common experience. After all, we see a certain parallel when this happens in history. Vitellius had retreated inward while the Danubian legions were coming to him like a meteor strike from space. Both physically and psychologically, he was completely detached from reality. His feasts continued, but the guests had grown fewer. Suetonius paints him as a man trying to drown the empire's ruin in wine. He had spent days on the Palatine, staring at the gilded ceilings Nero had built, as if they might remind him of a power he never truly possessed. When messengers brought news of Antonius' approach, he alternated between bursts of rage and tears. Rome looked like Berlin in 1945. Sensing the end, the Senate began finally shifting his allegiance officially. Several prominent men, including the consul Flavius Sabinus, Vespasian's brother, tried to negotiate a peaceful handover. They met Vitellius in the Forum, urging him to abdicate in exchange for his life. For a moment, he seemed ready. Tacitus records that he even tried to address the people from the rostra, declaring, "I will lay down my power for the peace of the state." The crowd, confused, loyal, and terrified, in this state of drugged stupor created by all of this feasting, all of this drinking, all of this waiting for the end, shouted their support for him. It was a chaotic scene, but there was an illusion of peace that shattered within hours. Vitellius' remaining soldiers, furious at what they saw as betrayal, stormed the Palatine, dragged their own emperor back inside by force, inside that golden palace that now looked more like a prison. Civil war had come to the streets of Rome, whether the emperor wanted it or not. And then, finally, the meteor strike arrived. On December 18, Antonius Primus reached the city. His army, hardened by Cremona, encamped along the Milvian Bridge. The next day, they marched in from the north, banner fluttering with the name of Vespasian. Tacitus and Cassius Dio both describe what followed as chaos beyond precedent. The Vitellian defenders, praetorians, sailors from the fleet, even slaves armed in desperation, barricaded the streets. The fighting lasted 3 days. The first clash came near the gardens of Sallust. The narrow streets neutralized the Danubian superior discipline. Men fought hand-to-hand in alleys filled with smoke. Fires broke out along the Quirinal hill. The Flavian troops advanced by torchlight, tearing down barricades, killing anyone who resisted. Tacitus writes that the temples were drenched in blood, the altars covered in corpses. By the second day of this Battle of Rome, the Flavian forced their way to the Forum, the Capitoline Hill, Rome's heart, where the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus stood. Now, before the Danubians arrived, Flavius Sabinus and the city prefects held this position briefly for Vespasian, but the Vitellian troops surrounded and stormed it. The temple burned. The sacred flame of Jupiter, a true relic of Rome, was extinguished as soldiers slaughtered one another amid the ruins of Rome's most ancient shrine. Tacitus calls it a crime as old as mankind, yet new in its horror. Vitellius fled through the burning city, disguised in ragged clothes. He took refuge in a porter's lodge on the Palatine, hiding among straw and refuse. But soldiers loyal to Antonius found him. Suetonius' account is brutal. They dragged him half-naked through the streets, showing everyone in the mob he once courted what he was, a weak man terrified of death. He was brought to the Gemonian Stairs, the place where condemned men met their end, and there he was struck down. His final words, if we believe Tacitus, were pitiful. "Yet I was your emperor." His body was mutilated and thrown into the Tiber. Finally, in the middle of a broken Rome, Antonius Primus stood in the Forum surrounded by soldiers drunk on victory and plunder. He addressed them briefly, reminding them that Rome is now Vespasian's. Then, without ceremony, he ordered the restoration of order. Executions of looters, reopening of the temples, burial of the dead. Tacitus remarks that it was the best that could be done after so much evil. It is as if he was truly hit by the magnitude of what was done and immediately started trying to repair it. Mucianus arrived days later. He was furious of what Antonius had done without him, but still the war was finished. He immediately assumed control of the administration, calming the Senate and restoring basic governance. From Egypt came the final act of the play, Vespasian's control of the grain supply. With Alexandria in his hands, the capital had no choice but to completely recognize him. And so came January 70 AD. Vespasian entered Rome not in triumph, but, let's admit it, in a whimper. He restored discipline to the legions, revived the finances of the state, and began to rebuild the capital. But he wasn't a conquering hero, and he wasn't loved, considering what happened in Rome. Tacitus gives him no flattery, but his tone changes, from tragedy to tired relief. The empire, for all its ruins, had found stability in the end. The year of the 4 emperors had lasted less than 12 months, but it had shaken the Roman world to its foundations. 4 men had claimed to inherit Nero's legacy, and 3 had perished in turn. When the fires were out and the marble dust settled on the Forum, 1 remained. Not by divine right, not even by complete conquest, but by endurance. Vespasian was smart. He had the trust of his commanders, their loyalty, the fact that they didn't declare themselves emperors after conquering Rome says a lot. Vespasian's reign would restore Rome's balance for a generation. Yet, behind the new peace, the ghost of 69 AD lingered. Governors capable of claiming the empire at any times had now risen everywhere. It was a new age, and we'll talk about it soon. Have a good one.